Book I of Eudemian Ethics. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Geoffrey Edwards. Eudemian Ethics by Aristotle. Translated by J. Solomon. Chapter 1. The man who stated his judgment in the god's precinct in Delos made an inscription on the propylaeum to the temple of Leto, in which he separated from one another the good, the beautiful, and the pleasant, as not all properties of the same thing. He wrote, "Most beautiful is what is most just, but best is health, and pleasantest the obtaining of what one desires." But let us disagree with him, for happiness is at once the most beautiful and best of all things, and also the pleasantest. Now, about each thing and kind there are many views that are disputed and need investigation. Of these, some concern knowledge only, some the acquisition of things, and the performance of acts as well. About those which involve speculative philosophy only, we must at a suitable opportunity say what is relevant to that study. But first we must consider in what the happy life consists, and how it is to be acquired, whether all who receive the epithet happy become so by nature, as we become tall, short, or of different complexions, or by teaching, happiness being a sort of science, or by some sort of discipline; for men acquire many qualities neither by nature nor by teaching, but by habituation; bad qualities if they are habituated to the bad, good if to the good. Or do men become happy in none of these ways, but either, like those possessed by nymphs or deities, through a sort of divine influence, being as it were inspired, or through chance? For many declare happiness to be identical with good luck. That men then possess happiness through all or some one of these causes is evident. For practically all new creations come under these principles. For all acts arising from intelligence may be included among acts that arise from knowledge. Now to be happy, to live blissfully and beautifully, must consist mainly in three things, which seem most desirable. For some say prudence is the greatest good, some virtue, and some pleasure. Some also dispute about the magnitude of the contribution made by each of these elements to happiness, some declaring the contribution of one to be greater, some that of another; these regarding prudence as a greater good than virtue, those the opposite, while others regard pleasure as a greater good than either. And some consider the happy life to be compounded of all or of two of these, while others hold it to consist in one of them alone. Chapter 2. First, then, about these things, we must enjoin every one that has the power to live according to his own choice to set up for himself some object for the beautiful life to aim at, whether honor, or reputation, or wealth, or culture, with reference to which he will then do all his acts, since not to have one's life organized in view of some end is a mark of much folly. Then, above all, we must first define to ourselves, without hurry or carelessness, in which of our belongings the happy life is lodged, and what are the indispensable conditions of its attainment. For health is not the same as the indispensable conditions of health, and so it is with many other things, e.g. the beautiful life, and its indispensable conditions are not identical. Of such things some are not peculiar to health, or even to life, but common, to speak broadly, to all dispositions and actions, e.g. without breathing, or being awake, or having the power of movement, we could enjoy neither good nor evil. But some are indispensable conditions in a more special sense, and peculiar to each kind of thing, and these it is specially important to observe, e.g. the eating of meat and walking after meals are more peculiarly the indispensable conditions of a good physical state than the more general conditions mentioned above. For herein is the cause of the disputes about happy living, its nature and causes. For some take to be elements in happiness what are merely its indispensable conditions. Chapter 3. To examine, then, all the views held about happiness is superfluous, for children, sick people, and the insane all have views, but no sane person would dispute over them. For such persons need not argument, but years in which they may change, or else medical or political correction. For medicine, no less than stripes, is a correction. Similarly, we have not to consider the views of the multitude, for they talk without consideration about almost everything, and most about happiness. For it is absurd to apply argument to those who need not argument but suffering. But since every study has its special problems, evidently there are such relating to the best life and best existence. The opinions, then, that put these difficulties it is well to examine, for a disputant's refutation of what is opposed to his argument is a demonstration of the argument itself. Further, it is proper not to neglect these considerations, especially with a view to that at which all inquiry should be directed, viz., the causes that enable us to share in the good and beautiful life, if any one finds it invidious to call it the blessed life, and with a view to the hope we may have of attaining each good. For if the beautiful life consists in what is due to fortune or nature, it would be something that many cannot hope for, since its acquisition is not in their power, nor attainable by their care or activity. But if it depends on the individual and his personal acts being of a certain character, then the supreme good would be both more general and more divine. More general, because more would be able to possess it; more divine, because happiness would then be the prize offered to those who make themselves and their acts of a certain character. Chapter 4. Most of the doubts and difficulties raised will become clear if we define well what we ought to think happiness to be, whether that it consists merely in having the soul of a certain character, as some of the sages and older writers thought, or whether the man must indeed be of a certain character. But it is even more necessary that his acts should be of a certain character. Now, if we make a division of the kinds of life, some do not even pretend to this sort of well-being, being only pursued for the sake of what is necessary, e.g., those concerned with vulgar arts, or with commercial or servile occupations. By vulgar, I mean arts pursued only with a view to reputation; by servile, those which are sedentary and wage-earning; by commercial, those connected with buying in markets and huckstering in shops. But there are also three goods directed to a happy employment of life, those which we have above called the three greatest of human goods, virtue, prudence, and pleasure. We thus see that there are three lives which all those choose who have power, viz., the lives of the political man, the philosopher, the voluptuary. For of these the philosopher intends to occupy himself with prudence and contemplation of truth, the political man with noble acts, i.e., those springing from virtue, the voluptuary with bodily pleasures. Therefore the latter calls a different person happy, as was indeed said before. Anaxagoras of Clazomene, being asked, who was the happiest of men, answered, none of those you suppose, but one who would appear a strange being to you, because he saw that the questioner thought it impossible for one not great and beautiful, or rich, to deserve the epithet happy, while he himself perhaps thought that the man who lived painlessly and pure of injustice, or else engaged in some divine contemplation, was really, as far as a man may be, blessed. Chapter 5. About many other things it is difficult to judge well, but most difficult about that on which judgment seems to all easiest, and the knowledge of it in the power of any man, viz., what of all that is found in living is desirable, and what, if attained, would satisfy our desire. For there are many consequences of life that make men fling away life, as disease, excessive pain, storms, so that it is clear that, if one were given the power of choice, not to be born at all would, as far at least as these reasons go, have been desirable. Further, the life we lead as children is not desirable, for no one in his senses would consent to return again to this. Further, many incidents involving neither pleasure nor pain, or involving pleasure but not of a noble kind, are such that, as far as they are concerned, non-existence is preferable to life. And generally, if one were to bring together all that all men do and experience, but not willingly, because not for its own sake, and were to add to this an existence of infinite duration, one would none the more on account of these experiences choose existence rather than non-existence. But further, neither for the pleasure of eating alone, or that of sex, if all the other pleasures were removed, that knowing, or seeing, or any other sense provides men with, would a single man value existence, unless he were utterly servile, for it is clear that to the man making this choice there would be no difference between being born a brute and a man. At any rate, the ox in Egypt, which they reverence as Apis, in most of such matters has more power than many monarchs. We may say the same of the pleasure of sleeping. For what is the difference between sleeping an unbroken sleep from one's first day to one's last, say for 1,000 or any number of years, and living the life of a plant? Plants, at any rate, seem to possess this sort of existence, and similarly children. For children, too, continue having their nature from their first coming into being in their mother's womb, but sleep the entire time. It is clear, then, from these considerations, that men, though they look, fail to see what is well-being, what is the good in life. And so they tell us that Anaxagoras answered a man who was raising problems of this sort, and asking why one should choose rather to be born than not, for the sake of viewing the heavens, and the whole order of the universe. He then thought the choice of life, for the sake of some sort of knowledge, to be precious. But those who felicitate Sardanapalus, or Smindarides the Sybarite, or any other of those who live the voluptuary's life, these seem all to place happiness in the feeling of pleasure. But others would rather choose virtuous deeds than either any sort of wisdom or sensual pleasures. At any rate, some choose these, not only for the sake of reputation, but even when they are not going to win credit by them. But most political men are not truly so called. They are not in truth political, for the political man is one who chooses noble acts for their own sake, while most take up the political life for the sake of money and greed. From what has been said, then, it is clear that all connect happiness with one or other of three lives: the political, the philosophic, and the voluptuaries. Now, among these, the nature and quality and sources of the pleasure of the body and sensual enjoyment are clear, so that we have not to inquire what such pleasures are, but whether they tend to happiness or not, and how they tend, and whether, supposing it right to attach to the noble life certain pleasures, it is right to attach these, or whether some other sort of participation in these is a necessity, but the pleasures through which men rightly think the happy man to live pleasantly, and not merely painlessly, are different. But about these let us inquire later. First, let us consider about virtue and prudence, the nature of each, and whether they are parts of the good life, either in themselves, or through the actions that arise from them, since all, or at least all important thinkers, connect happiness with these. Socrates, then, the elder, thought the knowledge of virtue to be the end, and used to inquire what is justice, what bravery, and each of the parts of virtue. And his conduct was reasonable, for he thought all the virtues to be kinds of knowledge, so that to know justice and to be just came simultaneously. For the moment that we have learned geometry or architecture, we are architects and geometers. Therefore he inquired what virtue is, not how or from what it arises. This is correct with regard to theoretical knowledge, for there is no other part of astronomy, or physics, or geometry, except knowing and contemplating the nature of the things which are the subjects of those sciences, though nothing prevents them from being in an incidental way useful to us for much that we cannot do without. But the end of the productive sciences is different from science and knowledge, e.g. health from medical science, law and order, or something of the sort, from political science. Now, to know anything that is noble is itself noble, but regarding virtue at least, not to know what it is, but to know out of what it arises is most precious. For we do not wish to know what bravery is, but to be brave, nor what justice is, but to be just, just as we wish to be in health, rather than to know what being in health is, and to have our body in good condition, rather than to know what good condition is. Chapter 6. About all these matters we must try to get conviction by argument, using perceived facts as evidence and illustration. It would be best that all men should clearly concur with what we are going to say. But if that is unattainable, then that all should in some way at least concur. And this, if converted, they will do, for every man has some contribution to make to the truth. And with this as a starting point, we must give some sort of proof about these matters. For by advancing from true but obscure judgments, he will arrive at clear ones, exchanging ever the usual confused statement for more real knowledge. Now, in every inquiry there is a difference between philosophic and unphilosophic argument. Therefore we should not think, even in political philosophy, that the sort of consideration which not only makes the nature of the thing evident, but also its cause, is superfluous, for such consideration is in every inquiry the true philosophic method. But this needs much caution, for there are some who, through thinking it to be the mark of a philosopher to make no arbitrary statement, but always to give a reason, often unawares give reasons foreign to the subject and idle. This they do sometimes from ignorance, sometimes because they are charlatans, by which reasons even men experienced and able to act are trapped by those who neither have nor are capable of having practical and constructive intelligence, and this happens to them from want of culture. For inability in regard to each matter to distinguish reasonings appropriate to the subject from those foreign to it is want of culture. And it is well to criticize separately the reason that gives the cause and the conclusion, both because of what has just been said, viz., that one should attend not merely to what is inferred by argument, but often attend more to perceived facts, whereas now, when men are unable to see a flaw in the argument, they are compelled to believe what has been said, and because often that which seems to have been shown by argument is true indeed, but not for the cause which the argument assigns, for one may prove truth by means of falsehood, as is clear from the Analytics. Chapter 7. After these further preliminary remarks, let us start on our discourse from what we have called the first confused judgments, and then seek to discover a clear judgment about the nature of happiness. Now, this is admitted to be the greatest and best of human goods. We say human, for there might perhaps be a happiness peculiar to some superior being, e.g. a god. For of the other animals which are inferior in their nature to men, none have a right to the epithet happy. For no horse, bird, or fish is happy, nor anything the name of which does not imply some share of a divine element in its nature. But in virtue of some other sort of participation in good things, some have a better existence, some a worse. But we must see later that this is so. At present we say that of goods some are within the range of human action, some not, and this we say because some things, and therefore also some good things, are incapable of change, yet these are perhaps, as to their nature, the best. Some things again are within the range of action, but only to beings superior to us. But since within the range of action is an ambiguous phrase, for both that for the sake of which we act, and the things we do for its sake have to do with practice, and thus we put among things within the range of action both health and wealth, and the acts done for the sake of these ends, i.e. wholesome conduct and money-bringing conduct, it is clear that we must regard happiness as the best of what is within the range of action for man. Chapter 8. We must then examine what is the best, and in how many senses we use the word. The answer is principally contained in 3 views. For men say that the good per se is the best of all things, the good per se being that whose property is to be the original good, and the cause by its presence in other things of their being good, both of which attributes belong to the idea of good. I mean by both that of being the original good, and also the cause of other things being good by its presence in them. For good is predicated of this idea most truly, other things being good by participation in and likeness to this. And this is the original good, for the destruction of that which is participated in involves also the destruction of that which participates in the idea, and is named from its participation in it. But this is the relation of the first to the latter, so that the idea of good is the good per se. For this is also, they say, separable from what participates in it, like all other ideas. The discussion, however, of this view belongs necessarily to another inquiry, and one for the most part more logical, for arguments that are at once destructive and general belong to no other science but logic. But if we must speak briefly about these matters, we say first that it is to speak abstractly and idly to assert that there is an idea, whether of good or of anything whatever. This has been considered in many ways, both in our popular and in our philosophic discussions. Next, however much there are ideas, and in particular an idea of good, they are perhaps useless with a view to a good life and to action. For the good has many senses, as numerous as those of being. For being, as we have divided it in other works, signifies now what a thing is, now quality, now quantity, now time, and again some of it consists in passivity, some in activity. And the good is found in each of these modes, in substance as mind and God, in quality as justice, in quantity as moderation, in time as opportunity, while as examples of it in change we have that which teaches and that which is being taught. As then being is not one in all that we have just mentioned, so neither is good, nor is there one science either of being or of the good. Not even things named good in the same category are the objects of a single science, e.g. opportunity or moderation. But one science studies one kind of opportunity or moderation, and another another, e.g. opportunity and moderation in regard to food are studied by medicine and gymnastics, in military matters by the art of strategy, and similarly with other sorts of action, so that it can hardly be the province of one science to study the good per se. Further, in things having a natural succession, an earlier and a later, there is no common element beyond, and further separable from them, for then there would be something prior to the first, for the common and separable element would be prior, because with its destruction the first would be destroyed as well. E.g., if the double is the first of the multiples, then the universal multiple cannot be separable, for it would be prior to the double if the common element turns out to be the idea, as it would be if one made the common element separable. For if justice is good, and so also is bravery, there is then, they say, a good per se, for which they add per se to the general definition. But what could this mean except that it is eternal and separable? But what is white for many days is no whiter than that which is white for a single day. So not even the common good would be identical with the idea, for it is the common property of all. But we should show the nature of the good per se in the opposite way to that now used. For now from what is not agreed to possess the good they demonstrate the things admitted to be good, e.g. from numbers they demonstrate that justice and health are goods, for they are arrangements and numbers, and it is assumed that goodness is a property of numbers, and units because unity is the good itself. But they ought, from what are admitted to be goods, e.g. health, strength, and temperance, to demonstrate that beauty is present even more in the changeless, for all these things in the sensible world are order and rest. But if so, then the changeless is still more beautiful, for it has these attributes still more. And it is a bold way to demonstrate that unity is the good per se, to say that numbers have desire. For no one says distinctly how they desire, but the saying is altogether too unqualified. And how can one suppose that there is desire where there is no life? One should consider seriously about this, and not assume, without reasons, what it is not easy to believe even with reasons. And to say that all existing things desire some one good is not true, for each seeks its own special good, the eye, vision, the body, health, and so on. There are then these difficulties in the way of there being a good per se. Further, it would be useless to political philosophy, which, like all others, has its particular good, e.g., as gymnastic has good bodily condition. Further, there is the argument written in the discourse, that the idea itself of good is useful to no art, or to all arts in the same way. Further, it is not practicable. And similarly, neither is good as a universal either the good per se, for it might belong even to a small good, or practicable. For medicine does not consider how to procure an attribute that may be an attribute of anything, but how to procure health, and so each of the other arts. But good is ambiguous, and there is in it a noble part, and part is practicable, but the rest not so. The sort of good that is practicable is an object aimed at, but not the good in things unchanging. It is clear then that neither the idea of good, nor the good as universal is the good per se, that we are actually seeking. For the one is unchanging and not practical, and the other, though changing, is still not practical. But the object aimed at as end is best, and the cause of all that comes under it, and first of all goods. This then would be the good per se, the end of all human action. And this would be what comes under the master art of all, which is politics, economics, and prudence. For these mental habits differ from all others by their being of this nature; whether they differ from one another must be stated later. And that the end is the cause of all that comes under it, the method of teaching shows. For the teacher first defines the end, and thence shows of each of the other things that it is good, for the end aimed at is the cause, e.g., since to be in health is so and so, so and so must needs be what conduces to it. The wholesome is the efficient cause of health, and yet only of its actual existence. It is not the cause of health being good. Further, no one demonstrates that health is good, except he is a sophist, and no doctor, but one who produces deceptive arguments from inappropriate considerations, any more than any other principle. We must now consider, making a fresh start, in how many senses the good, as the end of man, the best in the field of action, is the best of all, since this is best. End of Book 1. Recording in memory of Mitchell Edwards. Chapter 1 of Book 2 of Eudemian Ethics by Aristotle, translated by J. Solomon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Geoffrey Edwards. Chapter 1. After this, let us start from a new beginning and speak about what follows from it. All goods are either outside or in the soul, and of these, those in the soul are more desirable. This distinction we make even in our popular discussions, for prudence, virtue, and pleasure are in the soul, and some or all of these seem to all to be the end. But of the contents of the soul, some are states or faculties, others activities and movements. Let this then be assumed, and also that virtue is the best state or condition or faculty of all things that have a use and work. This is clear by induction, for in all cases we lay this down, e.g., a garment has an excellence, for it has a work and use, and the best state of the garment is its excellence. Similarly, a vessel, house, or anything else has an excellence. Therefore, so also has the soul, for it has a work. And let us assume that the better state has the better work, and as the states are to one another, so let us assume the corresponding works to be to one another. And the work of anything is its end. It is clear, therefore, from this that the work is better than the state, for the end is best, as being end. For we assume the best, the final stage, to be the end for the sake of which all else exists. That the work, then, is better than the state or condition is plain. But work has two senses, for some things have a work beyond mere employment, as architecture has a house, and not the act of building, medicine, health, and not the act of curing and restoring to health, while the work of other things is just their employment, e.g., of vision, seeing, and of mathematical science, contemplation. Hence, necessarily, in those whose work is their employment, the employment is more valuable than the state. Having made these distinctions, we say that the work of a thing is also the work of its excellence, only not in the same sense, e.g., a shoe is the work both of the art of cobbling and of the action of cobbling. If, then, the art of cobbling and the good cobbler have an excellence, their work is a good shoe, and similarly with everything else. Further, let the work of the soul be to produce living, this consisting in employment and being awake, for slumber is a sort of inactivity and rest. Therefore, since the work must be one and the same both for the soul and for its excellence, the work of the excellence of the soul would be a good life. This, then, is the complete good, which, as we saw, was happiness. And it is clear from our assumptions, for these were that happiness was the best of things, and ends and the best goods were in the soul, and it is itself either a state or an activity. Since the activity is better than the state, and the best activity than the best state, and virtue is the best state, that the activity of the virtue of the soul is the best thing. But happiness, we saw, was the best of things, therefore happiness is the activity of a good soul. But since happiness was something complete, and living is either complete or incomplete, and so also virtue, one virtue being a whole, the other a part, and the activity of what is incomplete is itself incomplete, therefore happiness would be the activity of a complete life in accordance with complete virtue. And that we have rightly stated its genus and definition, common opinions prove. For to do well and to live well is held to be identical with being happy. But each of these, living and doing, is an employment, an activity, for the practical life is one of using or employing, e.g., the smith produces a bridle, the good horseman uses it. we find confirmation also in the common opinion that we cannot ascribe happiness to an existence of a single day, or to a child, or to each of the ages of life, and therefore Solon's advice holds good never to congratulate a man when living, but only when his life is ended. For nothing incomplete is happy, not being whole. Further, praise is given to virtue because of its actions, but to actions something higher than praise, the encomium. And we crown the actual conquerors, not those who have the power to conquer, but do not actually conquer. Further, our judging the character of a man by his acts is a confirmation. Further, why is happiness not praised? Surely, because other things are praised owing to this, either by their having reference to it, or by their being parts of it. Therefore, felicitation, praise, and encomium differ. For encomium is discourse relative to the particular act. Praise declares the general nature of the man, but felicitation is for the end. This clears up the difficulty sometimes raised, why for half their lives the good are no better than the bad, for all are alike when asleep. The cause is that sleep is an inactivity, not an activity of the soul. Therefore, even if there is some other part of the soul, e.g., the vegetative, its excellence is not a part of entire virtue any more than the excellence of the body is. For in sleep the vegetative part is more active, while the perceptive and the appetitive are incomplete in sleep. But as far as they do to some extent partake of movement, even the visions of the good are better than those of the bad, except so far as they are caused by disease or bodily defect. After this we must consider the soul, for virtue belongs to the soul, and essentially so. But since we are looking for human virtue, let it be assumed that the parts of the soul partaking of reason are two, but that they partake not in the same way, but the one by its natural tendency to command, the other by its natural tendency to obey and listen. If there is a part without reason in some other sense, let it be disregarded. It makes no difference whether the soul is divisible or indivisible, so long as it has different faculties, namely those mentioned above, just as in the curved we have unseparated the concave and the convex, or again the straight and the white, yet the straight is not white except incidentally, and is not the same in essence. We also neglect any other part of the soul that there may be, e.g., the vegetative, for the above-mentioned parts are peculiar to the human soul. Therefore the virtues of the nutritive part, that concerned with growth, are not those of man. For if we speak of him qua man, he must have the power of reasoning, a governing principle, moral action, but reason governs not reason, but desire and the passions. He must then have these parts. And just as general good condition of the body is compounded of the partial excellences, so also the excellence of the soul qua end. But of virtue or excellence there are two species, the moral and the intellectual. For we praise not only the just, but also the intelligent and the wise. For we assumed that what is praiseworthy is either the virtue or its act, and these are not activities, but have activities. But since the intellectual virtues involve reason, they belong to that rational part of the soul which governs the soul by its possession of reason, while the moral belong to the part which is irrational, but by its nature obedient to the part possessing reason. For we do not describe the character of a man by saying that he is wise or clever, but by saying that he is gentle or bold. After this we must first consider moral virtue, its nature, its parts. For our inquiry has been forced back on this, and how it is produced. We must make our search as all do in other things. They search having something to start with. So here, by means of true but indistinct judgments, we must try to attain to what is true and distinct. For we are now in the condition of one who describes health as the best condition of the body, or Choriskos as the darkest man in the marketplace. For what either of these is, we do not know, but yet for the attainment of knowledge of either, it is worth while to be in this condition. First, then, let it be laid down that the best state is produced by the best means, and that with regard to everything the best is done from the excellence of that thing, e.g. the exercises and food are best which produce a good condition of body, and from such a condition men best perform exercises. Further, that every condition is produced and destroyed by some sort of application of the same things, e.g. health from food, exercises and weather. This is clear from induction. Virtue too, then, is that sort of condition which is produced by the best movements in the soul, and from which are produced the soul's best works and feelings. And by the same things, if they happen in one way, it is produced, but if they happen in another, it is destroyed. The employment of virtue is relative to the same things by which it is increased and destroyed, and it puts us in the best attitude towards them. A proof that both virtue and vice are concerned with the pleasant and the painful is that punishment, being cure, and operating through opposites, as the cure does in everything else, acts through these. Chapter 2. That moral virtue, then, is concerned with the pleasant and the painful is clear. But since the character, being, as its name indicates, something that grows by habit, and that which is under guidance other than innate is trained to a habit by frequent movement of a particular kind, is the active principle present after this process, but in things inanimate we do not see this, for even if you throw a stone upwards 10,000 times, it will never go upward except by compulsion. Consider then character to be this, viz. A quality in accordance with governing reason belonging to the irrational part of the soul, which is yet able to obey the reason. Now we have to state in respect of what part of the soul we have character of this or that kind. It will be in respect of the faculties of passion, in virtue of which men are spoken of as subject to passion, and in respect of the habits, in virtue of which men are described in reference to those passions, either as feeling them in some way, or as not feeling them. After this comes the division made in previous discussions into the passions, faculties, and habits. By passions I mean such as anger, fear, shame, sensual desire, in general, all that is usually followed of itself by sensuous pleasure or pain. Quality does not depend on these, they are merely experienced, but on the faculties. By faculty, I mean that in virtue of which men who act from their passions are called after them, e.g., are called irascible, insensible, amorous, bashful, shameless. And habits are the causes through which these faculties belong to us, either in a reasonable way or the opposite, e.g., bravery, temperance, cowardice, intemperance. Chapter 3. After these distinctions, we must notice that in everything continuous and divisible there is excess, deficiency, and the mean, and these in relation to one another, or in relation to us, e.g., in the gymnastic or medical arts, in those of building and navigation, and in any sort of action alike scientific and non-scientific, skilled and unskilled. For motion is continuous, and action is motion. In all, the mean in relation to us is the best, for this is as knowledge and reason direct us. And this everywhere also makes the best habit. This is clear both by induction and by reasoning, for opposites destroy one another, and extremes are opposite both to one another and to the mean. For the mean is to either extreme the other extreme, e.g., the equal is greater to the less, but less to the greater. Therefore moral virtue must have to do with the mean, and be a sort of mediety. We must then notice what sort of mediety virtue is, and about what sort of means. Let each be taken from the list by way of illustration and studied. irascibility, lack of feeling, gentleness. Audacity, cowardice, bravery. Shamelessness, shyness, modesty. Intemperance, insensibility, temperance. Envy, unnamed, righteous indignation. Gain, loss, the just. Lavishness, meanness, liberality. Boastfulness, self-depreciation, sincerity. Habit of flattery, habit of dislike, friendliness. Servility, stubbornness, dignity. Luxuriousness, submission to evils, endurance. Vanity, meanness of spirit, greatness of spirit. Extravagance, pettiness, magnificence. Cunning, simplicity, prudence. These and similar are the passions that occur in the soul. They receive their names, some from being excesses, some from being defects. For the irascible is one who is angry more than he ought to be, and more quickly, and with more people than he ought. The unfeeling is deficient in regard to persons, occasions, and manner. The man who fears neither what, nor when, nor as he ought, is confident. The man who fears what he ought not, and on the wrong occasions, and in the wrong manner, is cowardly. So intemperate is the name for one prone to sensual desire, and exceeding in all possible ways. While he who is deficient and does not feel desire, even so far as is good for him, and in accordance with nature, but is as much without feeling as a stone, is insensible. The man who makes profit from any source is greedy of gain. The man who makes it from none, or perhaps few, is a waster. The braggart is one who pretends to more than he possesses. The self-depreciator is one who pretends to less. The man who is more ready than is proper to join in praise is a flatterer. The man who is less ready is prone to dislike. To act in everything so as to give another pleasure is servility, but to give pleasure seldom and reluctantly is stubbornness. Further, one who can endure no pain, even if it is good for him, is luxurious. One who can endure all pain alike has no name literally applicable to him, but by metaphor is called hard, patient, or ready of submission. The vain man is he who thinks himself worthy of more than he is, while the poor-spirited thinks himself worthy of less. Further, the lavish is he who exceeds. The mean is he who is deficient in every sort of expenditure. Similar are the stingy and the purse-proud. The latter exceeds what is fitting, the former falls short of it. The rogue aims at gain in any way, and from any source. The simple not even from the right source. A man is envious in feeling pain at the sight of prosperity more often than he ought. For even those who deserve prosperity cause, when prosperous, pain to the envious. The opposite character has not so definite a name. He is one who shows excess in not grieving even at the prosperity of the undeserving, but accepts all, as gluttons accept all food, while his opposite is impatient through envy. It is superfluous to add to the definition that the particular relations to each thing should not be accidental. For no art, theoretical or productive, uses such additions to its definitions in speech or action. The addition is merely directed against logical quibbles against the arts. Take the above, then, as simple definitions, which will be made more accurate when we speak of the opposite habits. But of these states themselves there are species with names differing according as the excess is in time, in degree, or in the object provoking the state. E.g., one is quick-tempered through feeling anger quicker than one ought, irascible and passionate through feeling it more, acrid through one's tendency to retain one's anger, violent and abusive through the punishments one inflicts from anger. Epicures, gluttons, drunkards, are so named from having a tendency contrary to reason to indulgence in one or the other kind of nutriment. Nor must we forget that some of the faults mentioned cannot be taken to depend on the manner of action, if manner means excess of passion, e.g., the adulterer is not so called from his excessive intercourse with married women. Excess is inapplicable here, but the act is simply in itself wicked. The passion and its character are expressed in the same word. Similarly with outrage. Hence men dispute the liability of their actions to be called by these names. They say that they had intercourse but did not commit adultery, for they acted ignorantly or by compulsion, or that they gave a blow but committed no outrage, and so they defend themselves against all other similar charges. Chapter 4. Having got so far, we must next say that, since there are two parts of the soul, the virtues are divided correspondingly, those of the rational part being the intellectual, whose function is truth, whether about a thing's nature or genesis, while the others belong to the part irrational, but appetitive. For not any and every part of the soul, supposing it to be divisible, is appetitive. Necessarily, then, the character must be bad or good by its pursuit or avoidance of certain pleasures and pains. This is clear from our classification of the passions, powers, and states. For the powers and states are powers and states of the passions, and the passions are distinguished by pain and pleasure. So that for these reasons, and also because of our previous propositions, it follows that all moral virtue has to do with pleasures and pains. For by whatever things a soul tends to become better or worse, it is with regard to and in relation to these things that it finds pleasure. But we say men are bad through pleasures and pains, either by the pursuit and avoidance of improper pleasures or pains, or by their pursuit in an improper way. Therefore all readily define the virtues as insensibility or immobility as regards pleasures and pains, and vices as constituted by the opposites of these. Chapter 5. But since we have assumed that virtue is that sort of habit from which men have a tendency to do the best actions, and through which they are in the best disposition towards what is best, and best is what is in accordance with right reason, and this is the mean between excess and defect relative to us, it would follow that moral virtue is a mean relative to each individual himself, and is concerned with certain means in pleasures and pains, in the pleasant and the painful. The mean will sometimes be in pleasures, for there too is excess and defect, sometimes in pains, sometimes in both. For he who is excessive in his feeling of delight exceeds in the pleasant, but he who exceeds in his feeling of pain in the painful, and this either absolutely or with reference to some standard, e.g., when he differs from the majority of men, but the good man feels as he ought. But since there is a habit in consequence of which its possessor will in some cases admit the excess, in others the defect of the same thing, it follows that, as these acts are opposed to one another and to the mean, so the habits will also be opposed to one another and to virtue. It happens, however, that sometimes all these oppositions will be clearer, sometimes those on the side of excess, sometimes those on the side of defect. And the reason of the difference is that the unlikeness or likeness to the mean is not always of the same kind, but in one case one might change quicker from the excess to the middle habit, sometimes from the defect, and the person further distant seems more opposed, e.g., in regard to the body, excess in exercise is healthier than defect and nearer to the mean, but in food, defect is healthier than excess. And so of those states of will which tend to training now some, Now others will show a greater tendency to health in case of the two acts of choice, now those good at work, now those good at abstemiousness. And he who is opposed to the moderate and the reasonable will be the man who avoids exercise, not both, and in the case of food, the self-indulgent man, not the man who starves himself. And the reason is that from the start our nature does not diverge in the same way from the mean as regards all things. We are less inclined to exercise, and more inclined to indulgence. So it is too with regard to the soul. We regard then as the habit opposed to the mean that towards which both our faults and men in general are more inclined. The other extreme, as though not existent, escapes our notice, being unperceived because of its rarity. Thus we oppose anger to gentleness, and the irascible to the gentle. Yet there is also excess in the direction of gentleness, and readiness to be reconciled, and the repression of anger when one is struck. But the men prone to this are few, and all incline more to the opposite extreme. There is none of the spirit of reconciliation in anger. And since we have reached a list of the habits in regard to the several passions, with their excesses and defects, and the opposite habits, in virtue of which men are as right reason directs them to be, what right reason is, and with an eye to what standard we are to fix the mean, must be considered later, it is clear that all the moral virtues and vices have to do with excesses and defects of pleasures and pains, and that pleasures and pains arise from the above-mentioned habits and passions. But the best habit is that which is the mean in respect of each class of things. It is clear then that all, or at least some, of the virtues will be connected with means. Chapter 6. Let us then take another starting point for the succeeding inquiry. Every substance is by nature a sort of principle. Therefore each can produce many similar to itself, as man, man, animals in general, animals, and plants, plants. But in addition to this, man alone of animals is also the source of certain actions, for no other animal would be said to act. Such principles, which are primary sources of movements, are called principles in the strict sense, and most properly such as have necessary results. God is doubtless a principle of this kind. The strict sense of principle is not to be found among principles without movement, e.g., those of mathematics, though by analogy we use the name there also. For there too, if the principle should change, practically all that is proved from it would alter, but its consequences do not change themselves, one being destroyed by another, except by destroying the assumption, and by its refutation proving the truth. But man is the source of a kind of movement, for action is movement. But since, as elsewhere, the source or principle is the cause of all that exists, or arises through it, we must take the same view as in demonstrations. For if, supposing the triangle to have its angles equal to 2 right angles, the quadrilateral must have them equal to 4 right angles, it is clear that the property of the triangle is the cause of this last. And if the triangle should change, then so must the quadrilateral, having 6 right angles if the triangle has 3, and 8 if it has 4. But if the former does not change, but remains as it was before, so must the quadrilateral. The necessity of what we are endeavouring to show is clear from the Analytics. At present we can neither affirm nor deny anything with precision except just this. Supposing there were no further cause for the triangle's having the above property, then the triangle would be a sort of principle or cause of all that comes later, so that if anything existent may have the opposite to its actual qualities, so of necessity may its principles. For what results from the necessary is necessary, but the results of the contingent might be the opposite of what they are. What depends on men themselves forms a great portion of contingent matters, and men themselves are the sources of such contingent results. So that it is clear that all the acts of which man is the principal and controller may either happen or not happen, and that their happening or not happening, those at least of whose existence or non-existence he has the control, depends on him. But of what it depends on him to do or not to do, he is himself the cause, and what he is the cause of depends on him. And since virtue and vice, and the acts that spring from them, are respectively praised or blamed, for we do not praise or blame for what is due to necessity, or chance, or nature, but only for what we ourselves are causes of, for what another is the cause of, for that he bears the blame or praise, it is clear that virtue and vice have to do with matters where the man himself is the cause and source of his acts. We must then ascertain of what actions he is himself the source and cause. Now we all admit that of acts that are voluntary and done from the deliberate choice of each man, he is the cause, but of involuntary acts he is not himself the cause, and all that he does from deliberate choice he clearly does voluntarily. It is clear then that virtue and vice have to do with voluntary acts. End of chapter 6 of book 2. Recording in memory of Mitchell Edwards. Chapter 7 of book 2 of Eudemian Ethics by Aristotle. Translated by J. Solomon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Geoffrey Edwards. Chapter 7. We must then ascertain what is the voluntary and the involuntary, and what is deliberate choice, since by these virtue and vice are defined. First, we must consider the voluntary and involuntary. Of three things it would seem to be one: agreement with either desire, or choice, or thought. That is, the voluntary would agree, the involuntary would be contrary to one of these. But again, desire is divided into three sorts: wish, anger, and sensual appetite. We have then to distinguish these, and first to consider the case of agreement with sensual appetite. Now, all that is in agreement with sensual appetite would seem to be voluntary, for all the involuntary seems to be forced, and what is forced is painful, and so is all that men do and suffer from compulsion, as Aino says. All to which we are compelled is unpleasant. So that if an act is painful, it is forced on us, and if forced, it is painful. But all that is contrary to sensual appetite is painful, for such appetite is for the pleasant, and therefore forced and involuntary. What then agrees with sensual appetite is voluntary, for these two are opposites. Further, all wickedness makes one more unjust, and incontinence seems to be wickedness, the incontinent being the sort of man that acts in accordance with his appetite and contrary to his reason, and shows his incontinence when he acts in accordance with his appetite. But to act unjustly is voluntary, so that the incontinent will act unjustly by acting according to his appetite. He will then act voluntarily, and what is done according to appetite is voluntary. Indeed, it would be absurd that those who become incontinent should be more just. From these considerations, then, the act done from appetite would seem voluntary, but from the following the opposite. What a man does voluntarily he wishes, and what he wishes to do he does voluntarily. But no one wishes what he thinks to be bad. But surely the man who acts incontinently does not do what he wishes, for to act incontinently is to act through appetite contrary to what the man thinks best. Whence it results that the same man acts at the same time both voluntarily and involuntarily. But this is impossible. Further, the continent will do a just act, and more so than incontinence, for continence is a virtue, and virtue makes men more just. Now, one acts continently whenever he acts against his appetite in accordance with his reason, so that if to act justly is voluntary as to act unjustly is, for both these seem to be voluntary, and if the one is, so must the other be. But action contrary to appetite is involuntary, then the same man will at the same time do the same thing voluntarily and involuntarily. The same argument may be applied to anger, for there is thought to be a continence and incontinence of anger, just as there is of appetite, and what is contrary to our anger is painful, and the repression is forced, so that if the forced is involuntary, all acts done out of anger would be voluntary. Heraclitus, too, seems to be regarding the strength of anger when he says that the restraint of it is painful. It is hard, he says, to fight with anger, for it gives its life for what it desires. But if it is impossible for a man voluntarily and involuntarily to do the same thing at the same time, and in regard to the same part of the act, then what is done from wish is more voluntary than that which is done from appetite or anger, and a proof of this is that we do many things voluntarily without anger or desire. It remains then to consider whether to act from wish and to act voluntarily are identical, but this too seems impossible. For we assumed, and all admit, that wickedness makes men more unjust, and incontinence seems a kind of wickedness. But the opposite will result from the hypothesis above, for no one wishes what he thinks bad, but does it when he becomes incontinent. If, then, to commit injustice is voluntary, and the voluntary is what agrees with wish, then when a man becomes incontinent he will be no longer committing injustice, but will be more just than before he became incontinent. But this is impossible. That the voluntary, then, is not action in accordance with desire, nor the involuntary action in opposition to it, is clear. Chapter 8. But again, that action in accordance with, or in opposition to, choice is not the true description of the voluntary and involuntary is clear from the following considerations. It has been shown that the act in agreement with wish was not involuntary, but rather that all that one wishes is voluntary, though it has also been shown that one may do voluntarily what one does not wish. But we do many things from wish suddenly, but no one deliberately chooses an act suddenly. But if, as we saw, the voluntary must be one of these three, action according either to desire, choice, or thought, and it is not two of these, the remaining alternative is that the voluntary consists in action with some kind of thought. Advancing a little further, let us close our delimitation of the voluntary and the involuntary. To act on compulsion or not on compulsion seems connected with these terms, for we say that the enforced is involuntary, and all the involuntary is enforced, so that first we must consider the action done on compulsion, its nature and its relation to the voluntary and the involuntary. Now the enforced and the necessary, force and necessity, seem opposed to the voluntary and to persuasion in the case of acts done. Generally we speak of enforced action and necessity even in the case of inanimate things, for we say that a stone moves upwards and fire downwards on compulsion and by force. But when they move according to their natural internal tendency, we do not call the act one due to force, nor do we call it voluntary either. There is no name for this antithesis, but when they move contrary to this tendency, then we say they move by force. So too among things living and among animals we often see things suffering and acting from force, when something from without moves them contrary to their own internal tendency. Now in the inanimate the moving principle is simple, but in the animated there is more than one principle, for desire and reason do not always agree. And so with the other animals the action on compulsion is simple, just as in the inanimate, For they have not desire and reason opposing one another, but live by desire. But man has both, that is, at a certain age, to which we attribute also the power of action, for we do not use this term of the child, nor of the brute, but only of the man who has come to act from reason. So the compulsory act seems always painful, and no one acts from force and yet with pleasure. Hence there arises much dispute about the continent and incontinent, for each of them acts with two tendencies mutually opposed, so that, as the expression goes, the continent forcibly drags himself from the pleasant appetites, for he feels pain in dragging himself away against the resistance of desire, while the incontinent forcibly drags himself contrary to his reason. But still the latter seems less to be in pain. For appetite is for the pleasant, and this he follows with delight, so that the incontinent rather acts voluntarily and not from force, because he acts without pain. But persuasion is opposed to force and necessity, and the continent goes towards what he is persuaded of, and so proceeds not from force, but voluntarily. But appetite leads without persuading, being devoid of reason. We have then shown that these alone seem to act from force and involuntarily, and why they seem to, viz., from a certain likeness to the enforced action, in virtue of which we attribute enforced action also to the inanimate. Yet if we add the addition made in our definition, there also the statement becomes untrue. For it is only when something external moves a thing, or brings it to rest against its own internal tendency, that we say this happens by force, otherwise we do not say that it happens by force. But in the continent and the incontinent, it is the present internal tendency that leads them, for they have both tendencies, so that neither acts on compulsion nor by force, but as far at least as the above goes, voluntarily. For the external moving principle that hinders or moves in opposition to the internal tendency is what we call necessity, e.g., when we strike some one with the hand of one whose wish and appetite alike resist. But when the principle is from within, there is no force. Further, there is both pleasure and pain in both, for the continent feels pain now in acting against his appetite, but has the pleasure of hope, i.e., that he will be presently benefited, or even the pleasure of being actually at present benefited because he is in health, while the incontinent is pleased at getting through his incontinency what he desires, but has a pain of expectation, thinking that he is doing ill. So that to say that both act from compulsion is not without reason, the one sometimes acting involuntarily owing to his desire, the other owing to his reason. These two, being separated, are thrust out by one another. Whence men apply the language to the soul as a whole, because we see something like the above in the case of the elements of the soul. Now of the parts of the soul this may be said, but the soul as a whole, whether in the continent or the incontinent, acts voluntarily, and neither acts on compulsion, but one of the elements in them does, since by nature we have both. For reason is in them by nature, because if growth is permitted and not maimed, it will be there, and appetite because it accompanies and is present in us from birth. But these are practically the two marks by which we define the natural. It is either that which is found with us as soon as we are born, or that which comes to us if growth is allowed to proceed regularly, e.g., grey hair, old age, and so on. So that either acts in a way contrary to nature, and yet, broadly speaking, according to nature, but not the same nature. The puzzles, then, about the continent and incontinent are these: do both, or one of them, act on compulsion, so that they act involuntarily, or else at the same time both on compulsion and voluntarily? That is, if the compulsory is involuntary, both voluntarily and involuntarily. And it is tolerably clear from the above how these puzzles are to be met. In another way, too, men are said to act by force and compulsion without any disagreement between reason and desire in them, viz., when they do what they consider both painful and bad, but they are threatened with stripes, imprisonment, or death if they do not do it. Such acts, they say, they did on compulsion. Or shall we deny this, and say that all do the act itself voluntarily? For they had the power to abstain from doing it, and to submit to the suffering. Again, perhaps, one might say that some such acts were voluntary, and some not. For whatever of the acts that a man does without wishing them he has the power to do or abstain from doing, these he always does voluntarily and not by force. But those in which he has not this power he does by force in a sense, but not absolutely, because he does not choose the very thing he does, but the purpose for which it is done, since there is a difference too in this. For if a man were to murder another that he might not catch him at blind man's buff, he would be laughed at if he were to say that he acted by force and on compulsion. There ought to be some greater and more painful evil that he would suffer if he did not commit the murder. For then he will act on compulsion, and either by force, or at least not by nature, when he does something evil for the sake of good, or release from a greater evil. Then he will at least act involuntarily, for such acts are not subject to his control. Hence many regard love, anger in some cases, and natural conditions as involuntary, as being too strong for nature. We feel indulgence for them as things capable of overpowering nature. A man would seem to act from force and involuntarily if he acted to escape violent than if to escape gentle pain, and generally if to escape pain than if to get pleasure. For that which depends on him, and all turns on this, is what his nature is able to bear. What it is not, what is not under the control of his natural desire or reason, that does not depend on him. Therefore those who are inspired and prophesy, though their act is one of thought, we still say have it not in their own power either to say what they said, or to do what they did. And so of acts done through appetite, so that some thoughts and passions do not depend on us, nor the acts following such thoughts and reasonings, but, as Philolaus said, some arguments are too strong for us. So that if the voluntary and involuntary had to be considered in reference to the presence of force as well as from other points of view, let this be our final distinction. Nothing obscures the idea of the voluntary so much as the use of the expression that men act from force and yet voluntarily. Chapter 9. Since we have finished this subject, and we have found the voluntary not to be defined either by desire or by choice, it remains to define it as that which depends on thought. The voluntary, then, seems opposed to the involuntary, and to act with knowledge of the person acted on, instrument, and tendency. For sometimes one knows the object, e.g. as father, but not that the tendency of the act is to kill, not to save, as in the case of Peleus's daughters, or knows the object to be a drink, but takes it to be a philter or wine when it was really hemlock, seems opposed to action in ignorance of the person, instrument, or thing, if, that is, the action is essentially the effect of ignorance. All that is done owing to ignorance, whether of person, instrument, or thing, is involuntary. The opposite, therefore, is voluntary. All, then, that a man does, it being in his power to abstain from doing it, not in ignorance and owing to himself, must needs be voluntary. Voluntariness is this. But all that he does in ignorance and owing to his ignorance, he does involuntarily. But since science or knowledge is of two sorts, one the possession, the other the use of knowledge, the man who has but does not use knowledge may in a sense be justly called ignorant, but in another sense not justly, e.g. if he had not used his knowledge owing to carelessness. Similarly, one might be blamed for not having the knowledge if it were something easy or necessary, and he does not have it because of carelessness or pleasure or pain. This, then, we must add to our definition. Such, then, is the completion of our distinction of the voluntary and the involuntary. Chapter 10. Let us next speak about choice, first raising various difficulties about it, for one might doubt to what genus it belongs, and in which to place it, and whether the voluntary and the chosen are or are not the same. Now, some insist that choice is either opinion or desire, and the inquirer might well think that it was one or the other, for both are found accompanying it. Now, that it is not desire is plain, for then it would be either wish, appetite, or anger, for none desires without having experienced one of these feelings. But anger and appetite belong also to the brutes, while choice does not. Further, even those who are capable of both the former often choose without either anger or appetite, and when they are under the influence of those passions, they do not choose, but remain unmoved by them. Further, anger and appetite always involve pain, but we often choose without pain. But neither are wish and choice the same, for we often wish for what we know is impossible, e.g., to rule all mankind, or to be immortal, but no one chooses such things unless ignorant of the impossibility, nor even what is possible, generally, if he does not think it in his power to do or to abstain from doing it. So that this is clear, that the object of choice must be one of the things in our own power. Similarly, choice is not an opinion, nor generally what one thinks. For the object of choice was something in one's power, and many things may be thought that are not, e.g., that the diagonal is commensurable, and further, choice is not either true or false. Nor yet is choice identical with our opinion about matters of practice which are in our own power, as when we think that we ought to do or not to do something. This argument applies to wish as well as to opinion, for no one chooses an end, but the means to an end, e.g., no one chooses to be in health, but to walk or to sit for the purpose of keeping well. No one chooses to be happy, but to make money or run risks for the purpose of being happy. And in general, in choosing, we show both what we choose and for what we choose it, the latter being that for which we choose something else, the former that which we choose for something else. But it is the end that we specially wish for, and we think we ought to be healthy and happy. So that it is clear through this that choice is different both from opinion and from wish. For wish and opinion are specially of the end, but choice is not. It is clear, then, that choice is not wish, or opinion, or judgment simply. But in what does it differ from these? How is it related to the voluntary? The answer to these questions will also make it clear what choice is. Of possible things, then, there are some such that we can deliberate about them, while about others we cannot. For some things are possible, but the production of them is not in our power, some being due to nature, others to other causes, and about these none would attempt to deliberate except in ignorance. But about others, not only existence and non-existence is possible, but also human deliberation. These are things the doing or not doing of which is in our own power. Therefore, we do not deliberate about the affairs of the Indians, nor how the circle may be squared, for the first are not in our power, the second is wholly beyond the power of action. But we do not even deliberate about all things that may be done and that are in our power, by which it is clear that choice is not opinion simply, though the matters of choice and action belong to the class of things in our own power. One might then raise the problem, why do doctors deliberate about matters within their science, but not grammarians? The reason is that error may occur in two ways, either in reasoning or in perception when we are engaged in the very act, and in medicine one may go wrong in both ways, but in grammar one can do so only in respect of the perception and action. And if they inquired about this, there would be no end to their inquiries. Since then choice is neither opinion, nor wish singly, nor yet both, for no one chooses suddenly, though he thinks he ought to act, and wishes suddenly, it must be compounded of both, for both are found in a man choosing. But we must ask, how compounded out of these? The very name is some indication, for choice is not simply taking, but taking one thing before another, and this is impossible without consideration and deliberation. Therefore choice arises out of deliberate opinion. Now about the end no one deliberates, this being fixed for all, but about that which tends to it, whether this or that tends to it, and, supposing this or that resolved on, how it is to be brought about. All consider this till they have brought the commencement of the production to a point in their own power. If, then, no one deliberately chooses without some preparation, without some consideration whether it is better or worse to do so and so, and if one considers all that are in one's power of the means to the end which are capable of existing or not existing, it is clear that choice is a considered desire for something in one's own power, for we all consider what we choose, but we do not choose all that we consider. I call it considered when consideration is the source and cause of the desire, and the man desires because of the consideration. Therefore in the other animals choice does not exist, nor in man at every age or in every condition, for there is not consideration or judgment of the ground of an act. But it is quite possible that many animals have an opinion whether a thing is to be done or not, only thinking with consideration is impossible to them. For the considering part of the soul is that which observes a cause of some sort, and the object of an action is one of the causes, for we call cause that owing to which a thing comes about, but the purpose of a thing's existence or production is what we specially call its cause, e.g. of walking, the fetching of things, if this is the purpose for which one walks. Therefore those who have no aim fixed have no inclination to deliberate. So that since if a man of himself, and not through ignorance, does or abstains from that which is in his power to do or abstain from, he acts or abstains voluntarily. But we do many such things without deliberation or premeditation. It follows that all that has been deliberately chosen is voluntary, but not all the voluntary is deliberately chosen, and that all that is according to choice is voluntary, but not all that is voluntary is according to choice. And at the same time it is clear from this that those legislators define well who enact that some states of feeling are to be considered voluntary, some involuntary, and some premeditated, for if they are not thoroughly accurate, at least they approximate to the truth. But about this we will speak in our investigation of justice. Meanwhile it is clear that deliberate choice is not simply wish, or simply opinion, but opinion and desire together when following as a conclusion from deliberation. But since in deliberating one always deliberates for the sake of some end, and he who deliberates has always an aim by reference to which he judges what is expedient, no one deliberates about the end. This is the starting point and assumption, like the assumptions in theoretical science. We have spoken about this shortly in the beginning of this work, and minutely in the Analytics. Everyone's inquiry, whether made with or without art, is about what tends to the end, e.g. whether they shall go to war or not, when this is what they are deliberating about. but the cause or object will come first, e.g. wealth, pleasure, or anything else of the sort that happens to be our object. For the man deliberating deliberates if he has considered from the point of view of the end what conduces to bringing the end within his own action, or what he at present can do towards the object. But the object or end is always something good by nature, and men deliberate about its partial constituents, e.g. the doctor, whether he is to give a drug, or the general, where he is to pitch his camp. To them the absolutely best end is good. But contrary to nature, and by perversion, not the good, but the apparent good is the end. And the reason is that some things cannot be used for anything but what their nature determines, e.g. sight. For one can see nothing but what is visible, nor hear anything but what is audible. But science enables us to do what does not belong to that science. For the same science is not similarly related to health and disease, but naturally to the former, contrary to nature to the latter. And similarly, wish is of the good naturally, but of the bad contrary to nature. And by nature one wishes the good, but contrary to nature, and through perversion the bad as well. But further, the corruption and perversion of a thing does not tend to anything at random, but to the contrary, or the intermediate between it and the contrary. For out of this province one cannot go, since error leads not to anything at random, but to the contrary of truth, where there is a contrary, and to that contrary which is according to the appropriate science contrary. Therefore the error and the resulting choice must deviate from the mean towards the opposite, and the opposite of the mean is excess or defect. And the cause is pleasantness or painfulness, for we are so constituted that the pleasant appears good to the soul, and the more pleasant better, while the painful appears bad, and the more painful worse. So that from this also it is clear that virtue and vice have to do with pleasures and pains, for they have to do with objects of choice, and choice has to do with the good and bad, or what seems such, and pleasure and pain naturally seem such. It follows then, since moral virtue is itself a mean and wholly concerned with pleasures and pains, and vice lies in excess or defect, and is concerned with the same matters as virtue, that moral virtue is a habit tending to choose the mean in relation to us in things pleasant and painful, in regard to which, according as one is pleased or pained, men are said to have a definite sort of character. For one is not said to have a special sort of character merely for liking what is sweet or what is bitter. Chapter 11. These distinctions having been made, let us say whether virtue makes the choice correct, and the end right so that a man chooses for the right end, or whether, as some say, it makes the reason so. But what does this is continence, for this preserves the reason. But virtue and continence differ. We must speak later about them, since those who think that virtue makes the reason right do so for this cause, namely that continence is of this nature, and continence is one of the things we praise. Now that we have discussed preliminary questions, let us state our view. It is possible for the aim to be right, but for a man to go wrong in the means to that aim. And again the aim may be mistaken, while the means leading to it are right, or both may be mistaken. Does then virtue make the aim, or the means to that aim? We say the aim, because this is not attained by inference or reasoning. Let us assume this as starting point. For the doctor does not ask whether one ought to be in health or not, but whether one ought to walk or not. Nor does the trainer ask whether one ought to be in good condition or not, but whether one should wrestle or not. And similarly, no art asks questions about the end. For, as in theoretical sciences the assumptions are our starting points, so in the productive the end is starting point and assumed. E.g., we reason that since this body is to be made healthy, therefore so-and-so must be found in it if health is to be had, just as in geometry we argue, if the angles of the triangle are equal to two right angles, then so-and-so must be the case. The end aimed at is, then, the starting point of our thought, the end of our thought the starting point of action. If then of all correctness either reason or virtue is the cause, if reason is not the cause, then the end, but not the means, must owe its rightness to virtue. But the end is the object of the action, for all choice is of something, and for the sake of some object. The object, then, is the mean, and virtue is the cause of this by choosing it. Still, choice is not of this, but of the things done for the sake of this. To hit on these things, I mean what ought to be done for the sake of the object, belongs to another faculty, but of the rightness of the end of the choice the cause is virtue. And therefore it is from a man's choice that we judge his character, that is, from the object for the sake of which he acts, not from the act itself. Similarly, vice makes the choice to be for the sake of the opposite object. If then a man, having it in his power to do the honourable and abstain from the base, does the opposite, it is clear that this man is not good. Hence it follows that both vice and virtue are voluntary, for there is no necessity to do what is wicked. Therefore vice is blamable, and virtue praiseworthy. For the involuntary, if base or bad, is not blamable, if good, is not praiseworthy, but only the voluntary. Further, we praise and blame all men with regard to their choice rather than their acts, though activity is more desirable than virtue, because men may do bad acts under compulsion, but no one chooses them under compulsion. Further, it is only because it is not easy to see the nature of a man's choice that we are forced to judge of his character by his acts. The activity, then, is more desirable, but the choice more praiseworthy. And this both follows from our assumptions, and is in agreement with observation. End of Book 2. Recording in memory of Mitchell Edwards.